Over the past year, the legal fight between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni has already produced headlines, lawsuits, and endless speculation. But as the case moves closer to court, the focus is no longer just on what happened in the past. Now, the real question is how this battle will actually be decided. With the trial date approaching in May 2026, Blake Lively's legal team has made it clear that they want the case placed directly in the hands of a jury. In recent court filings, Lively's attorneys strongly defended their request for a jury trial, arguing that the case has reached a point where it should be evaluated by ordinary citizens rather than dismissed through legal technicalities. Their argument centers on the idea that a full body of evidence has already been collected during months of legal discovery, and that evidence deserves to be examined in open court. According to her lawyers, the dispute involves factual questions about what actually happened during the production of It Ends With Us, and those questions should ultimately be decided by a jury. This latest filing came in response to ongoing efforts from Justin Baldoni's legal team to challenge parts of Lively's lawsuit. Baldoni's lawyers have continued trying to narrow or dismiss portions of the claims against him, arguing that some of the allegations should not move forward in court. Lively's attorneys pushed back directly against that strategy, saying that attempts to end the case early ignore the large amount of material that has already been gathered through the legal process. During discovery, both sides exchanged extensive records connected to the film's production and the events that followed. These materials reportedly include internal communications, messages, and other documents tied to the dispute. Lively's lawyers say this growing collection of evidence makes it even more important for the case to proceed to trial. From their perspective, the courtroom is the only place where the full story can be examined properly. Another key point in Lively's argument involves a recent federal appeals court ruling that her legal team cited in their filing. According to her attorneys, that decision supports the idea that when a case already contains significant factual disputes and documented evidence, judges should allow juries to evaluate the claims rather than shutting the case down prematurely. By referencing this ruling, Lively's team is essentially telling the court that the legal system already provides a clear path forward. Let a jury hear the facts and decide what actually happened. This moment is especially significant because the timeline of the case is tightening. The federal court has already scheduled the trial to begin on May 18, 2026. As that date approaches, both sides are racing to finalize their legal strategies, file last-minute motions, and shape how the case will be presented in court. Each new filing now carries more weight because it could influence how the trial unfolds once proceedings begin. At the same time, earlier attempts to resolve the dispute outside the courtroom appear to have failed. Reports indicate that mediation efforts earlier in 2026 did not lead to a settlement between the two sides. That breakdown means the conflict is increasingly likely to be decided through a full trial rather than a private agreement. For both Lively and Baldoni, the stakes are extremely high because the courtroom process could expose internal communications, behind-the-scenes discussions from the film's production, and testimony from people who were directly involved. What makes this stage of the case particularly important is that it shifts the focus away from legal maneuvering and toward the possibility of public testimony. If the court agrees with Lively's position and allows the case to proceed fully to trial, a jury could eventually hear detailed accounts from the people connected to the production, examine the evidence collected during discovery, and determine whose version of events is more credible. Right now, the judge overseeing the case must decide how these competing arguments will move forward as the trial date draws closer. And with each new filing, the legal confrontation between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni is entering a phase where the decisions made in court could shape not only the outcome of the case, but also how the entire dispute is remembered. As the case moves deeper into the pre-trial phase, the legal strategies on both sides have become increasingly aggressive. With the May 2026 trial date approaching, each new filing is not just about technical legal arguments anymore. Instead, both teams are now focused on shaping how the story will ultimately be presented in front of a jury. For Blake Lively's attorneys, the goal is to ensure that the full timeline of events surrounding the production of It Ends With Us is examined openly in court. In their recent response to Baldoni's legal motions, Lively's lawyers emphasized that the dispute involves factual disagreements that cannot simply be resolved through paperwork or procedural arguments. They argued that the central issues in the case, what happened during the production, how concerns were handled, and what actions followed, are questions that require testimony and direct evaluation of evidence. According to their filing, the role of the jury is essential because jurors are responsible for weighing conflicting accounts and determining credibility. Baldoni's legal team, however, continues to push back strongly against that approach. His attorneys have argued that parts of Lively's claims should be dismissed before trial, maintaining that the lawsuit contains allegations they believe are legally flawed or unsupported. From their perspective, allowing the case to proceed to a full jury trial could create unnecessary reputational damage and prolong a dispute they argue should be resolved earlier in the legal process. This clash over how the case should move forward has now become one of the central battlegrounds in the courtroom. Motions, responses, and counterarguments have been exchanged repeatedly in recent months, with both sides attempting to influence how much of the dispute ultimately reaches the jury. While this type of legal maneuvering is common in high-profile civil cases, the intense public attention surrounding the conflict has made every new development widely scrutinized. Another factor shaping the upcoming trial is the amount of evidence that has already been collected. During discovery, lawyers on both sides gathered documents, communications, and witness statements related to the film's production and the events that followed. Discovery is often the stage where legal teams gain a clearer understanding of the other side's arguments, and in this case, it reportedly produced a large volume of material that could become central to the trial. If the case proceeds as currently scheduled, some of that evidence could be introduced during courtroom proceedings. That means jurors may be asked to review internal communications connected to the film's production, examine timelines of conversations between individuals involved in the project, and listen to testimony explaining how events unfolded behind the scenes. Legal experts often note that when cases reach this stage, the interpretation of evidence becomes just as important as the evidence itself. At the same time, the collapse of earlier settlement discussions has made a courtroom showdown increasingly likely. Mediation is often used to avoid long and expensive trials, especially in disputes involving public figures. But reports indicate that previous attempts to negotiate an agreement between Lively and Baldoni did not produce an agreement. Once those talks ended without progress, the case began moving steadily toward the trial phase now scheduled for May. For both sides, the upcoming trial represents more than just a legal decision. In disputes involving public figures, courtroom proceedings can have long-term effects on reputations, professional relationships, and future career opportunities. Because the conflict has already attracted major media attention, any testimony or evidence presented during the trial will likely receive intense public scrutiny. As a result, the next steps in the case could determine whether the dispute remains largely confined to legal filings or becomes a much more visible public courtroom battle. With the judge still reviewing arguments related to motions and trial procedures, the coming weeks will play a crucial role in determining exactly how the case unfolds once proceedings begin. And as the timeline moves closer to May 18th, both legal teams are preparing for the possibility that the final outcome will ultimately be decided not by legal filings alone, but by the judgment of a jury sitting inside the courtroom. As the scheduled trial date approaches, the case is entering its most critical phase. In federal court, the weeks leading up to a trial are often filled with final motions, procedural arguments, and decisions that determine exactly what the jury will and will not be allowed to see. For Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, those decisions could shape the entire outcome of the case. One of the key issues the judge must resolve before the trial begins involves the scope of evidence that can be presented. In high-profile civil cases, judges often review large amounts of material gathered during discovery and determine which documents, communications, and testimony are legally admissible. Because both sides collect extensive records related to the production of It Ends With Us, these rulings could significantly influence how the story is presented to jurors. Lively's legal team has continued emphasizing that the evidence gathered during discovery supports their argument that the dispute deserves to be heard fully in court. Their filings suggest that multiple communications and records from the production period help establish the timeline of events and the environment on set. By insisting on a jury trial, her attorneys are effectively arguing that the credibility of those records and statements should be evaluated publicly rather than filtered through pre-trial dismissals. On the other hand, Baldoni's lawyers are expected to focus heavily on challenging how that evidence is interpreted. In civil trials, legal teams often attempt to frame the same documents or conversations in very different ways. Baldoni's defense will likely argue that the available evidence does not support the claims made against him, and that the situation has been misrepresented during the legal process and in public discussion. If the case proceeds as planned, the trial itself could involve testimony from individuals who were connected to the film's production. Witnesses in civil cases may include colleagues, crew members, or others who had direct knowledge of the events being examined. Jurors would then be asked to listen to those accounts, review the presented documents, and determine which version of events they find more convincing. Another important element of the upcoming proceedings is the role of jury deliberation. In civil cases like this one, jurors are responsible for evaluating the credibility of testimony, determining whether the legal standards for the claims have been met, and deciding whether damages should be awarded. Unlike legal motions handled solely by judges, jury trials rely heavily on how clearly each side presents its narrative and supports it with evidence. Because the dispute has already drawn widespread media attention, the trial could also become one of the most closely followed celebrity court cases in recent years. High-profile trials often attract intense public interest, especially when they involve well-known figures and allegations tied to major film productions. Media coverage, courtroom reporting, and analysis from legal experts are likely to accompany nearly every stage of the proceedings once the trial begins. For both Lively and Baldoni, the courtroom will represent the most direct opportunity to present their arguments in full. After months of filings, responses, and procedural battles, a jury trial would allow each side to explain their perspective through evidence, testimony, and cross-examination. Ultimately, the jurors would be responsible for deciding how the facts should be interpreted and whether the claims brought in the lawsuit are legally supported. With the trial date now set for May 18, 2026, the remaining weeks before the proceedings begin are likely to determine how the final stage of this legal conflict unfolds. The decisions made during these final preparations will shape what jurors hear, what evidence they examine, and how the case is ultimately resolved. And once the courtroom proceedings begin, the dispute that started behind the scenes of a film production will move into a public legal arena where the outcome will depend entirely on the evidence presented and the judgment of a jury.